Hi, welcome to the tutorial on neuro-symbolic methods. My name is Crystal Ismith. I'm a professor at the University of Waterloo.
And I'm Michael Furlong, also a researcher at the University of Waterloo.
Today, we'll be presenting techniques on symbolic and other forms of structure manipulation using neural networks.
The problem we want to solve with these methods starts from the observation that humans are really good at reasoning, and that this reasoning often depends on their ability to manipulate symbols. That is, we want to use structured representations like those found in language and mathematics to perform this reasoning. And these structured representations allow people to extrapolate to unseen data in much better and more sophisticated ways than standard neural networks. In other words, we're better at generalization. Of course, we think both artificial and real neural networks manipulate vectors. So the question is, what is the difference between real brain-based networks and standard artificial networks such that humans can perform reasoning and generalization really well, where standard artificial networks struggle? This relates directly to topics in week 2, day 5 of this course on high-level cognition. The methods that we're going to be looking at are ones that have been used to build large-scale models of biological cognition. You can see an example of such a model running here on the right. This is a model that we built in our lab called SPAUN, which stands for Semantic Pointer Architecture Unified Network, SPAUN. It performs all kinds of different tasks. It does structured reasoning, as well as standard things like classification, motor control, and so on. What we want to talk about today is how we got structured representations into a large-scale spiking brain model like SPAUN. Now, as I've already mentioned, we always think of neural networks as doing vector manipulations. Typically, we think of the results of those manipulations as appearing in the activities of the neural network, and the weights between the layers of the network are defining the computation. So the question really is, how can we use that standard way of thinking about neural networks to solve cognitive tasks? Now, of course, what cognitive tasks require is precisely structured representations. Representations like those I've already mentioned, including math and language. But the notion captures essentially all the standard data structures that you might find in computer science. So this includes things like lists and trees and so on. In addition, we want to think about perhaps more continuous representations, things like maps, which sometimes go beyond what we often think of in computer science. Beyond representation, we also need to manipulate those representations in order to perform the reasoning, or we need cognitive computations. So these will include things like composing different structured representations to create new ones, being able to do generalization based on structure, not just on content, and of course, transform structures in various ways. The approach we'll be taking in order to do this consists in adopting what is called a vector symbolic algebra, or VSA. VSAs may not be familiar to many of you, but essentially we're starting with the following hypothesis. In order to capture the kinds of structured representations required for cognitive tasks, like the ones I just mentioned, the brain manipulates high-dimensional vectors in a way that is captured by a set of algebraic operations. Of course, if you pick different operations, then you're picking a different VSA. So a good VSA will be one that supports the kind of cognitive operations that we see in people. Let's look at an example. Here's a task called the Wason card task. So you're confronted with 4 cards. On every card, there's a letter on one side of the card and a number on the other side. Now I'm going to give you an abstract rule about these cards, and your job is to determine which cards do you have to turn over in order to determine that the rule is true or not of these cards. Here's the rule. If there's a vowel on one side, then there has to be an even number on the other side. Remember, your challenge is to determine which cards you must turn over in order to verify this rule. You can pause the video here for a moment, or maybe you've already figured it out. The answer is, you need to turn over the A card. If there's an odd number in the back, then the rule's been violated. And you must also turn over the 3 card, because if there's a vowel on the other side of that card, the rule has also been violated. You don't need to turn over any other cards. This actually turns out to be a fairly challenging task for people. Regardless of how well people perform on this task, let's think about how we can represent this task in a way that's computable by neural networks, brains or otherwise. We can break the problem into 2 parts. One is to think about the concepts used and how they're represented, and the other is to think about how to represent or capture the relationships between those concepts. Beginning with the first, we can think of concepts or symbols that are used as being points on a high-dimensional hypersphere. This is a very standard way of thinking about concepts in neural networks. And of course, I can't draw a high-dimensional hypersphere, so I've drawn a 3-dimensional sphere. And we can think of symbols in this way by just labeling particular vectors. So maybe that is the even vector, and maybe this is the vowel vector. We'll think of those as being the latent state of a neural population. So this notion should be fairly familiar, and throughout most of the tutorial, we'll be generating those vectors randomly. Of course, in the brain, we don't think that the latent states are random. Instead, we think these symbols derive their meaning by being compressed from sensory or motor input and by their relationship to other symbols. That is, the way in which they're used in a particular VSA statement. Now, this way of thinking about meaning and thinking about such vectors as being implemented in brain states is another story. And in fact, it's a long story. And so we have a name for these kinds of vectors because they're very central to the vector. We call them semantic pointers. Now, we're not going to be using this terminology today. Instead, we're just going to be talking about vectors. So once we've represented all of the concepts involved, of course, we need to represent the relationships. So we have to represent the structure. For instance, if we consider that rule that we saw before, if there's a vowel on one side of the card, then there's an even number on the other side, we would classically capture it in something like this way. Vowel implies even. Now, of course, we don't know how to manipulate this using a neural network, right? We know how to write code in order to manipulate it. So the question is, how can we write this neuro-symbolically? And here's a suggestion that comes from VSAs. We take all of the vectors that we identified using the previous methods, and we bind them using a binding operator, which is represented here as an asterisk surrounded by a circle. And then we bundle them or collect them together using another operator, here represented by a plus sign. In the particular VSA that we're going to be considering, the binding operator is circular convolution, and the bundling operator is addition. Now, the critical thing to notice about these two operators is that they act in really different ways. The plus sign, or superposition, essentially overlays vectors on top of one another, so the resulting vector is similar to both of the input vectors. But convolution intertwines the vectors, represented here by a rope, in such a way that the resulting vector, the bound vector, looks nothing like either of the inputs to that binding. This is an important observation that we'll come back to on several occasions. Now, we've got our representations. We've got both structure represented and we have concepts represented. But of course, we need to manipulate those representations in order to answer questions or do other kinds of transformations to the representations. So for instance, we might ask the question, what is the antecedent of that particular rule? So how would we compute that? Well, what we can do is take the inverse of the antecedent symbol, bind that with the rule representation, and then we can show algebraically that we should get the resulting vowel. Now, of course, vowel is the antecedent, and the consequent is even. So what does this look like algebraically? So you can see here I've written it out for us. And it's really just the way you would expect vector algebra to work. So if I bind an inverse with the original rule, and that would mean that the inverse cancels out the non-inverse of that, antecedent inverse cancels antecedent, and then you just have vowel. And of course, the inverse of antecedent is also bound with a bunch of other stuff, but the result is essentially noise. So it's a vector that we don't recognize because we haven't labeled it as a symbol. Now, when we have that vowel representation plus noise, we often want to get rid of the noise. So another critical part of computation using neuro-symbolic methods like this is using something called a cleanup memory. You can think of this as a kind of denoising operator. And last but not least, we want to recognize the resulting vector as a particular labeled vector. So we can use a similarity operator to compare it to the set of vectors in our vocabulary to determine which one it actually is. So to this point, we've seen how to use neuro-symbolic methods to capture a cognitive-like task, one that requires the manipulation of structure. So we saw how to represent concepts, how to represent the relationships between concepts, and then how to perform computations over those representations. We did all of these using a vector symbolic algebra. And that can be defined by 5 operations. In fact, throughout this tutorial, we're going to assume a particular vector symbolic algebra, one that is called holographic reduced representations, or HRRs. In this table, I've identified the general categories of operations that are required to define a vector symbolic algebra. In fact, there are many suggestions about what those operators can be for binding, bundling, similarity, and all of the above. But I've also identified the specific one that we're using on the right-hand side. As I introduced already, we have a similarity operator, in this case, just a dot product, which is used to determine when two concepts are the same or how similar they are. To do binding, we're using circular convolution. To do unbinding, we're also using circular convolution, but one of the symbols is inverted. To perform bundling, we're using superposition. And last but not least, we have cleanup, which is something that is defined slightly differently for semantic pointers than for HRs, but in any case, there's a wide variety of possible cleanup operations. And we'll return to each of these in more detail throughout the course of the tutorial. Now, something that we worry a lot more about when building models of biological cognition than we do if we're just thinking about vector symbolic algebras is implementation in the brain. That is, how are each of those operators actually captured by a microcircuit? Some of these operations are quite easy to understand as being embeddable in a neural network. So for instance, similarity is just multiplying the activities by the weights. Bundling is also quite easy because Kirchhoff's law essentially adds currents that flow into neurons. Binding is a little bit more complicated because it's something like circular convolution. Nevertheless, we can perform a Fourier transform, which is just a linear operation, and we can then multiply the activities in the Fourier space together to perform that binding. And I'll come back to this in a minute. Last, we've got unbinding, which, as I've already mentioned, is really just binding plus a permutation because our inverse is a permutation. And last but not least, we have cleanup. And there are many ways this can be accomplished. In the next two slides, I'm going to talk a little bit more about binding and cleanup because they're critical and slightly more difficult to implement in a spiking neural network than the other operators. A key theme of this course is microcircuits. In fact, you dedicated all of week 2, day 1 to the topic. So we can ask the microcircuit question. That is, how might we build a binding microcircuit? Now, I'll admit that we have a technique in our back pocket that makes this a bit easier, and it's called the Neural Engineering Framework, or NEF. And this actually lets us analytically compute the weights for any computation, dynamic or otherwise. In this case, it's not a dynamic computation, it's just a feed-forward one. So we can write that down explicitly. In this instance, the convolution between two vectors a and b is equal to the inverse Fourier transform of the Fourier transform of A, element-wise multiplied by the Fourier transform of B. Now, because both the inverse and the Fourier transform are linear operators, they're pretty easy to embed in the weights. The challenge is really how do we multiply the activities once we're in the Fourier space? Because we have the NEF, we can write down an expression, this one I've shown here. And this tells us what the weight should be in order to effectively multiply the activities of A and B representations in the Fourier space to give us the binding that we want at the output. Now, without going into any details, I think it's instructive to see this in operation. So on the right-hand side here, we've got a neural circuit. And in fact, it's two binding circuits combined together. The first one on the top is going to bind the two inputs shown in the left in the boxes. And then the next binding microcircuit, it's going to do the inverse. It's going to do an unbinding. So to understand what these boxes are showing, they're essentially vectors. And then the similarity between the vectors that are being represented by those boxes and any other vector in the vocabulary is shown at the top. So in this instance, the top box is representing the red vector, and the bottom box is representing the square vector. And right now, the result of that isn't really similar to anything when we do the unbinding, right? So you see square written there, but it has a similarity that's equal to 0. So now when we run the circuit, we're showing those vectors in the latent space, but we can also see some spiking activity. And that just demonstrates that this is, in fact, a spiking neural network. And we can see that once we switch the unbinding input to red, which is happening right now, then the output becomes square. So this is basically saying I bound red and square, and then I want to unbind red, and the answer is going to be most similar to the vector for square. So we can see that this is performing, in fact, two binding operations, a binding and an unbinding, and it's doing this in a spiking neural network. This then shows a binding microcircuit. Now, similarly, we're also interested in cleanup memory. This turns out to be a little bit more complicated. It's a difficult computation to perform, and essentially it's a max function. But it's really important because it lets us recognize valid representation once we've done something like unbind them from a complicated structure. Ultimately, we can think of this as an associative memory because really what it's doing is essentially getting rid of the noise in a representation. So we're performing auto-association between a vector and a noisy version of that vector. If you're familiar with auto-associative memories, you'll know that there are, in fact, many different types of operations that perform this function. So you could just do a max function. That's a max over the similarity between the input noisy vector and all the vectors that are valid. Or we could stick the vector into a Hopfield network, which performs a mapping onto the most similar vector of the ones that are in the long-term memory of the Hopfield network. Or in fact, we can construct a feed-forward network explicitly using techniques like the ones we've seen on the previous slide. Let's look at what happens when we do that. Really, this is looking at the results of building such a microcircuit, and also noting that it scales extremely well. So in this particular instance, we're looking at about 60,000 terms or concepts. We're using a 500-dimensional vector for each concept. We're putting 8 pairs of concepts together, and you can think of these as slot filler pairs if you would like. And then we're going to be cleaning those up. And we've done this actually for many different dimensions and many different sizes of lexicon. The dashed line is the one that I was speaking about specifically. We can also map that entire circuit onto the cortex. And when we do that, it takes about 9 square millimeters of cortex. So this includes the binding, the unbinding, and the cleanup. And that's not really very much. And it's quite consistent with the kinds of connectivities that we find in mammalian cortex. This is also extremely fast. So it only takes about 10 milliseconds to give you an answer. And that's actually quite different from what you typically find in something like a Hopfield network, because Hopfield networks have a lot of recurrent connections. So this graph is summarizing the accuracy. It's essentially showing that for a particular number of dimensions, if you want 99% accurate cleanup memory, so that means you get the right answer 99% of the time, and you've got about 60,000 concepts, that's what the dotted line is showing, which is the number of concepts in the average human vocabulary, then with a 300-dimensional vector, you can actually do an extremely good job, even for many different items in your structured representation. Ultimately, the last two slides that we've just looked at are really something that matter when we care about implementing these operations in spiking neural networks, and we want to make sure that they're biologically plausible. Throughout most of the tutorial, however, we're really going to be thinking about these representations in the latent vector space, and so we won't be talking a lot about implementation after this. Nevertheless, one of the things that I did emphasize on the previous slide is that this cleanup memory can scale really well, that is to the size of adult human vocabularies. And I think it's worth dwelling on this for a bit, because of course, if we have a neuro-symbolic technique which can't scale to the size of a human vocabulary, then of course we've got a problem. And in fact, lots of the past techniques people have done for representing manipulation and structural representation in general actually run into these kinds of scaling problems. So using the VSA that we've introduced here, I want to show an example demonstrating that it does in fact scale really well. So here is an experiment. You can see the results of that. And what we did is take the concepts in WordNet. There are about 100,000 concepts in WordNet. And we used a representation similar to the one I was talking about on the previous slide, so 512 dimensional vectors. And then we encoded a lot of the relations that are captured by WordNet. You can think of a central relation as being like an is-a relation. So a dog is an animal, and an animal is a living thing is a kind of object, and so forth. So there's these relationships between dogs and living things and objects, and they're captured by those is-a relations. And that's captured in WordNet, and in WordNet, you get about 13 levels of this kind of relationship, so you've got actually quite a big hierarchy. So the question is, if we encode all of that information into a spiking neural network, can we extract it? Can we extract it accurately? Can we put it into more complicated structures and still get that information out, and so on? And basically what this table is showing is that the answer to these questions is yes. The first experiment that we performed here is just decoding a particular concept. And you can see that you can perfectly decode any concept that you've stuck into such a hierarchy. In the second row, there we're doing what we call hierarchy traversal. And in this instance, we're providing two inputs to the network and asking, are these two inputs related in some way by this is-a relation, let's say? And here you can see that about 95% of the time, we can tell whether or not any two concepts are connected by an is-a relation, which is quite good, since this is including up to 13 levels of distance in the hierarchy. And last but not least, we're saying, okay, can we take those same concept representations, encode them into more complicated structures, and then still perform those same kinds of processing tasks so we can recognize what all the concepts are? And again, the answer is yes. And I just want to give you a quick example of the kind of sentences that we're encoding things in. So for instance, here we can see an example sentence. The spiders slowly knit the lamp the dog stole. And as you can see, these are randomly generated because we're really just taking verbs and adjectives, nouns, and so on, and combining them into something that's grammatically appropriate, but of course not necessarily semantically appropriate. But then we can see that using these VSA techniques, we can in fact extract all of the relevant representations, identify them within our cleanup memory with over 99% accuracy. So you might be wondering, how are we doing this? We only have 512 dimensions. There are over 100,000 concepts in WordNet, and we're not just encoding the concepts, but a bunch of relationships between them as well. So what exactly is going on here? And in short, this extremely good scaling comes from the fact that we're working in a very high dimensional vector space. And I love to repeat this little sentence that I've got here. High dimensional spaces are amazing places. What this means is that some of our intuitions tend to break down when we go into these high dimensional spaces. Sometimes this, in fact, turns out to be a good thing. For instance, in this case, when we're trying to pack a lot of information into a vector space, it actually works out pretty well. So let's consider a particular example to get an intuition for what I mean. Suppose we have a problem of trying to pack a bunch of vectors into a space. We put the constraint that they must be separated by a minimum of 10 degrees, and this is because they might be noisy, and we might want to be able to do cleanup, so any vectors near some other vectors should actually count as the same vector, and so on. Suppose we're in a two-dimensional space, and we're thinking about unit vectors here, so all the vectors lie on the unit circle. There are 360 degrees in a circle, so there are 36 vectors that we can pack into that two-dimensional space. If we add one dimension to the space, we suddenly get 413 vectors, a massive increase. And in fact, on the right-hand side, I've plotted how many vectors you can pack into vector spaces of the number of dimensions indicated along the bottom while keeping them separated by 10 degrees. And as you can see, when you get to 8 dimensions, you have about 5 million vectors that you can pack in. Of course, we're working with vectors that have 512 dimensions. So the number of vectors you can put in there is astronomical. Instead, of course, of having them like evenly spaced, we think that you might have a lot fewer vectors that you can pack in. Maybe we want them to be a lot farther apart. There might be a lot of structure in the way that things are packed in and so on. But I think this still gives you a good intuition for why this kind of approach can scale so well. So to this point, we've looked at an example of how we can construct a neuro-symbolic representation in the case of the Wason card task. We saw how we can manipulate that representation, and we then generalized that technique to see that there are 5 different operators that are in fact important that can be used to define a wide variety of representations and structures. We then thought briefly about implementing that in the brain and thinking of it as biologically plausible. And then last, we stepped back and saw, why does this scale so well to the level of human cognition? Now, I want to notice that we've been essentially assuming something about all of the representations we've looked at so far. That is, that the slots and the fillers are chosen from a finite or discrete space. So in the case of the Wason card task, we had a rule, and it was equal to the relation being implication, the antecedent being vowel, and the consequent being even. Now, each of those slots and the fillers that can go in are chosen from a finite space of concepts. And this, of course, is a very powerful kind of representation. We can capture things like trees, ordered lists, graphs, and so on. In fact, as I mentioned at the very beginning, this is essentially capturing the kinds of discrete data structures that we tend to find in computer science. But there's another kind of representation that we often manipulate cognitively, and that is maps. In this instance, we don't have discrete slots, but instead we have something like continuous slots that are defined over a metric space. So in this island picture that we've got on the right-hand side here, any point over that space could have a feature of interest. Maybe it's a hill or a lake or a house or what have you. So the question I want to turn to now is, how can we build structured representations that have continuous slots? Luckily, we can do this without introducing any new operators in order to generate continuous representations. Specifically, what we can do is we can generate a slot by naming the axes of this space that we're interested in. So suppose we want to represent a two-dimensional space. We can name those axes x and y. X and y are both vectors that we've generated in the standard way. Now, to represent a point on those axes, we can take each vector and convolve it with itself a fractional number of times. So suppose I wanted to represent the point 1, 1.1. Then I would take the x-axis and put it to the power of 1, and the y-axis and put it to the power of 1.1, and then bind those representations together to give me a slot at that location. Once we have those slots, and of course we can put them anywhere we want in the metric space, so little x and little y can be real, then we can bind those slots with object vectors represented as we've always represented them. This will allow us to construct an overall representation of a map, just by bundling all of those objects bound to their particular spatial locations together. I want to be clear that this map M is just another vector in the same dimensional space as all of the concepts, just as the rule in the Wason card task was. Now, of course, to see what's in the map, it's often helpful to visualize it as a continuous space. So what I'm showing on the right-hand side is what would happen if we embedded two objects at two distinct spatial locations. So the object in the top left is at about minus 0.2, 1.8, and the one at the bottom right is at about 2.5, minus 2. Ultimately, what we're going to want to be able to do is manipulate these kinds of representations in the same way that we might manipulate a rule. Now, of course, spatial cognition is one of the more sophisticated types of cognition that we see in humans, and so it's important to have these types of representations in order to capture that aspect of neuro-symbolic computing in brains as well. So that concludes the introductory lecture for today's tutorial. In the remainder of the tutorial, you're going to be diving into these concepts in a lot more detail. So you'll be looking at the operators that we use to define the VSA. You'll be using those operators in order to manipulate vectors. You'll be understanding how you can combine those operations in order to perform a simple cognitive task, and we're going to start with some examples of analogy. We're then going to turn to a slightly more complicated kind of representation, in particular the one that I introduced at the beginning for the Wason card task. But we'll also be introducing learning into that task, answering the question, how can we build a system that actually learns to manipulate those kinds of inferential rules? Once we introduce learning, we can begin to touch on some other interesting topics, like what kind of inductive bias have we imposed? Can that improve our sample efficiency when we're learning new tasks? Of course, this is one of the key reasons that we might care about structured representation. And last but not least, we'll be returning to this notion of a continuous slot filler representation, and we will build and query some maps for object location. I hope you enjoy the rest of the tutorial.